Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly extraordinary. A pharaoh so radical, so dangerous to the established order, that after his death, they tried to erase every trace of his existence from history. We're diving into the story of Akhenaten, the heretic king who nearly destroyed 3,000 years of Egyptian tradition in just 17 years. Forget the stable, eternal Egypt Hollywood sold you absurd. The truth is, this civilization came closer to complete collapse than you might imagine, all because of one man's revolutionary vision. So, before we cross into the ancient world, take a moment to like this video, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and subscribe if you'd like to join me on more journeys through history. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in tonight and what time zone is keeping you company. There's something beautiful about how these voices from antiquity unite us across time and distance. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1353 BCE, and the world, as Egypt has known it for over a millennium, is about to change forever. The morning sun rises over Thebes, casting long shadows across the great temple of Karnak. The priests of Amun-Ra begin their daily rituals, just as they have for generations. The incense burns, the chants echo through stone corridors, and the god-king prepares for another day of maintaining Mat, the cosmic order that keeps Egypt prosperous and eternal. But today is different. Today, a young prince named Amenhotep will make a decision that will shake the very foundations of the ancient world. You see, Egypt in 1353 BCE was not just a kingdom, it was the superpower of the ancient world, a civilization that had endured for over 1,500 years through careful balance, tradition, and the divine mandate of the pharaohs. The priests of Amun-Ra held enormous power, controlling vast wealth and land that stretched across the known world. The military was strong, disciplined, and battle-tested, with borders that had remained secure for generations. Trade flowed along. The Nile, like the river itself, steady and eternal, bringing gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and tribute from dozens of vassal states. The wealth of Egypt was legendary even in the ancient world. Foreign ambassadors would arrive at the royal court and find themselves overwhelmed by displays of opulence that seemed to defy human imagination. Walls covered in gold leaf reflected the light of countless oil lamps. Furniture, inlaid with ivory and precious stones, filled rooms larger than entire houses in other kingdoms. Gardens bloomed with exotic plants brought from the far corners of the empire, watered by ingenious irrigation, systems that seemed to make the desert itself bloom. But Prince Amenhotep, soon to become Amenhotep IV, saw something different when he looked at his kingdom. Where others saw prosperity and stability, he saw corruption and stagnation. Where they saw the blessing of the gods, he saw the manipulation of priests who had grown fat on centuries of unchallenged power. Where they saw eternal tradition, he saw a system that had become rigid and lifeless, more concerned with maintaining its own power than serving the divine will. The prince who would become Akhenaten was born into the most powerful family on earth, but his childhood was marked by experiences that would shape his revolutionary vision. His father, Amenhotep III, ruled over an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Gold flowed from Nubian mines in quantities that amazed foreign visitors. Tribute poured in from vassal states across the Near East. Egypt's influence reached every corner of the known world, and its pharaoh was acknowledged as the most powerful ruler on earth. Yet young Amenhotep grew up in a world where this very success had bred complacency and corruption. The priesthood had become a hereditary caste, more interested in preserving their privileges than serving the gods. The military, unchallenged, for generations, had grown soft and ceremonial. The bureaucracy that governed the empire had become bloated and inefficient, more concerned with protocol than effective administration. The very success of Egyptian civilization had created the conditions for its potential downfall. The young prince was different from his predecessors in ways that became apparent early in his life. Where other royal children were content to learn the traditional skills of kingship, he questioned everything. Where they accepted the established religious framework without question, he began to see fundamental flaws in the system. Where they were content to work within existing power structures, he began to envision a world where the pharaoh alone communicated with the divine, unmediated by the corrupt priesthood that had inserted itself between the king and the gods. His education was comprehensive, as befitted a future pharaoh. He learned to read and write in hieroglyphic, hieratic, and cuneiform scripts. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. He was trained in military tactics and diplomacy. He learned the complex rituals and ceremonies that governed Egyptian religious life. But unlike his predecessors, he didn't simply absorb this knowledge passively. He questioned, he analyzed, he looked for inconsistencies and contradictions in the system he was being prepared to inherit. The signs of his revolutionary thinking appeared early in his reign, even before he made his dramatic religious proclamation. Traditional Egyptian art had followed strict conventions for over 1,000 years, conventions that were considered sacred and unchangeable. Pharaohs were depicted as perfect, idealized figures, their bodies conforming to mathematical proportions that represented divine perfection. Their faces were serene and eternal, showing no emotion or individual characteristics. They were shown in formal poses that emphasized their divine nature and their role as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. But Amenhotep IV commissioned art that broke every one of these sacred conventions. He ordered artists to show him as he really was, with his elongated features, his protruding belly, his feminine hips, his unusual physical characteristics that may have been the result of genetic disorders. His family was shown in intimate moments that had never before been depicted in royal art, kissing, embracing, playing with their children, displaying the kind of human emotion and affection that was considered inappropriate for divine beings. This artistic revolution was scandalous to the Egyptian establishment. The priests were horrified by what they saw as a desecration of sacred artistic traditions. The court officials were confused by the departure from established protocol. The common people were bewildered by images of their god-king that showed him as human and vulnerable, rather than divine and eternal. But Amenhotep IV was undeterred. He saw this artistic revolution as the first step in a much larger transformation of Egyptian civilization. The art was just the beginning. a visible symbol of the much more profound revolution that was taking place in the young pharaoh's mind. The real revolution started when he began to question the very nature of divinity itself, to challenge assumptions about the relationship between gods and humans that had been accepted without question for over a millennium. For over 1,000 years, Egyptians had worshipped a complex pantheon of gods, each with their own sphere of influence, their own priests, their own temples, their own elaborate rituals and ceremonies. Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, was the most powerful, but he shared the divine realm with hundreds of other deities. Osiris ruled the underworld and judged the dead. Isis protected mothers and children and possessed powerful magic. Thoth governed wisdom and writing and served as the scribe of the gods. Hathor presided over love and music and joy. Ptah was the creator god and patron of craftsmen. Sobek controlled the Nile and its crocodiles. Bastet protected cats and households. The list went on and on, a vast and complex hierarchy of divine beings that governed every aspect of Egyptian life. This system had worked for Egypt for centuries, providing a divine explanation for every aspect of existence, from the flooding of the Nile to the movement of the stars. It gave the priesthood enormous power and wealth, as each god required temples, offerings, and elaborate rituals. It created a complex web of religious obligations that kept the population focused on spiritual rather than political matters. It provided a sense of stability and continuity that helped hold the empire together across vast distances and diverse populations. But Amenhotep IV saw something else in this system, something that troubled him deeply. He saw division where there should be unity, complexity where there should be simplicity, and human intermediaries where there should be direct divine connection. He began to believe that the multiplicity of gods was not a strength but a weakness, that it diluted divine power and created opportunities for corruption and manipulation by the priesthood. The more he studied the traditional religious system, the more convinced he became that it was fundamentally flawed. The priests claimed to speak for the gods, but how could anyone verify their claims? They performed elaborate rituals behind closed doors, but who could say whether these rituals actually accomplished anything? They demanded enormous offerings and tribute, but where was the evidence that the gods actually received or appreciated these gifts? Gradually, a new vision began to take shape in the young pharaoh's mind. What if there was only one God, one divine force that governed the universe? What if all the other gods were merely aspects or manifestations of this one supreme deity? What if the pharaoh, as the divine king, could communicate directly with this God without the need for priestly intermediaries? This vision was revolutionary in ways that are difficult for us to appreciate today. In the ancient world, monotheism was virtually unknown. Most cultures worshipped multiple gods, and the idea that only one God existed was almost inconceivable. Even cultures that elevated one god above others still acknowledged the existence of lesser deities. The concept of a single, universal God, who was the sole source of divine power, was unprecedented in human history. And so, in the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made a decision that would change everything. He declared that there was only one God worthy of worship, the Aten, the solar disk, and that he, the pharaoh, was this God's only representative on earth. The announcement sent shockwaves through Egyptian society that reverberated from the royal court to the humblest village along the Nile. Overnight, thousands of years of religious tradition were declared invalid. The great temples of Amun-Ra, Osiris, and Isis, which had been the centers of Egyptian spiritual life for generations, were closed. Their priests, who had wielded enormous power and influence, were stripped of their positions and their wealth. Their elaborate rituals, which had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life, were banned. Their sacred texts, which had been copied and recopied for centuries, were declared heretical. In their place, a new religion emerged, centered entirely on the worship of the Aten and the absolute authority of the Pharaoh. This new religion was unlike anything that had existed before in Egypt or anywhere else in the ancient world. It was uncompromisingly monotheistic, declaring that the Aten was the only god and that all other deities were false. It was centered on the royal family, who were presented as the only intermediaries between humanity and the divine. It was focused on the worship of the sun, which was seen as the visible manifestation of the Aten's power. To mark this revolutionary change, Amenhotep IV changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten or one who serves the Aten. His queen, Nefertiti, became Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of Aten. The beautiful one has come. Even their daughters received names honoring the new god, Meritaten, beloved of the Aten, Meketaten, protected by the Aten, and Khisenemen. She lives for the Aten. The royal family became living embodiments of the new faith, and there every action was designed to demonstrate the power and glory of the Aten. But Akhenaten wasn't content with simply changing Egypt's religion. He understood that such a radical transformation required more than just new beliefs. It required a complete restructuring of Egyptian society. The old religious system was so deeply embedded in every aspect of Egyptian life that it would be impossible to eliminate it. While remaining in the traditional centers of power, the temples of Thebes were too powerful, the priesthood too entrenched. He would abandon Thebes, the ancient capital that had been the seat of Egyptian power for centuries, a place where his revolutionary vision could be implemented without interference from entrenched interests. The site he chose for his new capital was a stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile, about halfway between Memphis and Thebes. It was virgin territory, untouched by previous pharaohs, unclaimed by any god except the Aten. The location was strategically chosen for both practical and symbolic reasons. It was far enough from the traditional centers of power to be free from their influence, but close enough to the Nile to have access to transportation and water. It was in the heart of Egypt, symbolically representing the central role that the new religion would play in Egyptian life. Here, Akhenaten declared, he would build Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, a city that would serve as the new capital of Egypt and the center of the new religion. The construction of this new city would be one of the most ambitious building projects in ancient history, requiring the mobilization of thousands of workers, artists, and administrators. But Akhenaten was determined to create something unprecedented, a city that would embody his revolutionary vision and serve as a model for the new Egypt he was trying to create. The construction of Akhenaten was a massive undertaking that required not just enormous resources, but also a complete reimagining of how a city should be designed and built. Traditional Egyptian cities had grown organically over centuries, with new buildings added as needed and old ones modified or replaced. They were dense, crowded places where different social classes lived in close proximity, where temples and palaces were mixed in with workshops and residential areas. But Akhenaten was planned from the beginning as a unified whole, designed according to a carefully thought-out vision that reflected Akhenaten's religious beliefs and political goals. The city was laid out along a north-south axis that followed the curve of the Nile, with the most important buildings positioned to take advantage of the river's life-giving presence. At its center stood the great temple of the Aten, an enormous complex of open courtyards and altars where the royal family could worship the sun god in the open air. This temple was revolutionary in its design, abandoning every convention of traditional Egyptian religious architecture. Traditional Egyptian temples were dark, mysterious spaces designed to house the secret rituals of the priesthood. They were built like fortresses, with massive walls and small windows that kept the interior in perpetual twilight. The most sacred areas were accessible only to the highest-ranking priests, and the common people were excluded from the most important ceremonies. But the great temple of the Aten was the opposite of everything that had come before. It was bright and airy, its altars exposed to the rays of the sun. Its courtyards were open to the sky, allowing the Aten's light to flood every corner of the sacred space. There were no dark inner sanctuaries, no hidden chambers where priests could perform secret rituals. Everything was open, visible, accessible to the light of the Aten. Surrounding the temple were the royal palaces, administrative buildings, and residential quarters for the court and the city's inhabitants. The architecture was as revolutionary as the temple design, abandoning the heavy, monumental style of traditional Egyptian buildings in favor of lighter, more graceful structures that seemed to dance in the desert light. The buildings were decorated with scenes of natural beauty, with plants and animals and landscapes that celebrated the Aten's creation rather than the traditional scenes of divine power and royal authority. Gardens and pools provided relief from the harsh climate, while elaborate decorations celebrated the beauty of the natural world, a place where the divine and human worlds could meet in harmony. Every detail was carefully planned to reinforce the new religious message and to create an environment that would inspire devotion to the Aten. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Akhenaten was its art. Freed from the constraints of traditional Egyptian artistic conventions, the artists of the new city created works of unprecedented naturalism and emotional depth. The famous bust of Nefertiti, with its perfect features and enigmatic smile, was created during this period. So were the intimate family scenes that showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti playing with their daughters under the benevolent rays of the Aten. This new art style, known today as the Amarna style, after the modern name for Akhenaten, was unlike anything that had come before in Egyptian history. Where traditional Egyptian art had been formal and idealized, Amarna art was naturalistic and emotional. Where traditional art had emphasized the divine nature of the Pharaoh, Amarna art showed him as a loving husband and father. Where traditional art had been static and eternal, Amarna art was dynamic and alive, full of movement and emotion. The artists of Amarna were encouraged to experiment, to break free from the rigid conventions that had governed Egyptian art for over a millennium. They developed new techniques for showing depth and perspective, new ways of depicting light and shadow, new approaches to composition and color. They created art that was not just beautiful, but emotionally powerful, art that could move the viewer and inspire devotion to the new religion. The religious revolution that Akhenaten initiated was equally radical and far-reaching. The new religion centered on the worship of the Aten, represented as a solar disk with rays ending in hands that offered the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal family. Unlike the traditional Egyptian gods, who were depicted in human or animal form, the Aten was an abstract concept, a force of nature that could only be approached through the pharaoh. This monotheistic vision was revolutionary in the ancient world. While other cultures had occasionally elevated one god above others, none had declared that only one god existed and that all others were false. Akhenaten's religion was uncompromising in its exclusivity, demanding the complete abandonment of all other deities and the total devotion to the Aten alone. The implications of this religious revolution were enormous and far-reaching. If only the Aten existed, then the entire Egyptian religious establishment was based on a lie. The priests who had served the traditional gods for centuries were not holy men, but frauds. The temples that had been built to house these gods were not sacred spaces, but monuments to falsehood. The rituals that had been performed for generations were not acts of worship, but empty ceremonies. This was not just a religious revolution, but a complete restructuring of Egyptian society. The traditional priesthood had been one of the most powerful institutions in Egypt, controlling vast amounts of land and wealth, employing thousands of people, and wielding enormous political influence. By declaring their gods false and their rituals meaningless, Akhenaten was not just changing religious beliefs, but dismantling an entire social and economic system. Akhenaten's new religion also had profound political implications that went to the very heart of how Egypt was governed. In traditional Egyptian religion, the pharaoh was divine, but he shared the divine realm with many other gods. The priests of these gods served as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, giving them enormous power and influence. They could claim to speak for the gods, to interpret divine will, to perform rituals that were essential for the welfare of the kingdom. But in Akhenaten's religion, the pharaoh was the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine. All religious authority flowed through him, making him not just a king, but a prophet, a priest, and a god all in one. This concentration of religious authority in the person of the pharaoh was unprecedented in Egyptian history and represented a fundamental shift in the nature of royal power. Previous pharaohs had been powerful, but they had always had to negotiate with the priesthood and respect the traditional religious framework. They had to share power with the temples, to consult with the priests on important decisions, to follow established religious protocols in their public and private lives. But Akhenaten, by claiming direct divine authority that could not be questioned or challenged, freed himself from all these constraints. He was not just the representative of the gods, he was the only channel through which the divine could be accessed. This gave him absolute authority over every aspect of Egyptian life, from the grandest matters of state to the most intimate details of personal belief. It was a level of power that no pharaoh had ever possessed before, and it would prove to be both the source of his revolutionary achievements and the cause of his ultimate downfall. The royal family played a central and unprecedented role in this new religious system. Nefertiti was not just the queen, but the high priestess of the Aten, participating in religious ceremonies and serving as a model of devotion for the people. She was shown in temple reliefs, performing rituals that had traditionally been reserved for male priests, offering sacrifices to the Aten, and leading prayers and ceremonies. Their daughters were living proof of the Aten's blessing, their very existence demonstrating the gods' favor toward the royal family. They were shown in family scenes that emphasized their role as bridges between the divine and human worlds, playing and laughing under the protective rays of the Aten. These images were not just artistic representations, but religious propaganda, designed to show the people how they should relate to the new god and the new royal family. The famous scenes of the royal family worshipping together under the rays of the Aten were revolutionary in their intimacy and emotional content. They presented the royal family not as distant, godlike figures, but as loving parents and devoted worshippers who could serve as models for ordinary Egyptians. This was a complete departure from traditional royal iconography, which had always emphasized the divine nature of the pharaoh and his separation from ordinary humanity. But while Akhenaten was creating his revolutionary new world at Akhenaten, the rest of Egypt was struggling to adapt to the dramatic changes he had imposed. The closure of the traditional temples had disrupted the economic and social systems that had sustained Egyptian civilization for centuries. These temples had not just been religious institutions, but major economic centers, controlling vast amounts of land and wealth, employing thousands of people, and providing essential services to local communities. Thousands of priests found themselves unemployed overnight, their skills and knowledge suddenly worthless in the new religious order. These men had devoted their lives to serving the traditional gods, learning complex rituals and ceremonies, studying ancient texts, and maintaining the elaborate temple complexes that had been the centers of Egyptian spiritual life. Now they were told that everything they had learned was false, that their gods were illusions, that their life's work had been meaningless. The elaborate festivals and ceremonies that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life were banned, leaving people without the religious framework that had given meaning and structure to their existence. These festivals had been more than just religious observances. They had been social events that brought communities together, economic opportunities that provided income for craftsmen and merchants, and cultural celebrations that reinforced Egyptian identity and values. The economic impact of Akhenaten's reforms was particularly severe and far-reaching. The traditional temples had not just been religious institutions, but major economic centers that controlled vast amounts of land and wealth. They had employed thousands of people, from priests and scribes to farmers and craftsmen. They had sponsored trade expeditions that brought exotic goods from distant lands. They had funded public works projects that provided employment and improved infrastructure. They had provided social services to the poor and needy, including food distribution, medical care, and education. When Akhenaten closed these temples and redirected their resources to the worship of the Aten, he disrupted the entire Egyptian economy. The land that had belonged to the temples was confiscated and given to supporters of the new religion. Wealth that had been accumulated over centuries was seized and used to fund the construction of Akhenaten. The trade networks that had been maintained by the temples were disrupted, causing shortages of essential goods and materials. The social impact was equally profound and disruptive. Egyptian society had been organized around the worship of the traditional gods for over a millennium. Local communities had their patron deities who were believed to protect them from harm and ensure their prosperity. Professional guilds had their protective gods who were thought to bless their work and ensure their success. Families had their household shrines where they worshipped ancestors and minor deities who were believed to watch over their daily lives. The sudden abandonment of these religious traditions left people feeling lost and disconnected, unsure of how to navigate a world where the gods they had worshipped all their lives were suddenly declared to be false. The psychological impact of this religious revolution cannot be overstated. For most Egyptians, religion was not just a set of beliefs, but a way of life that governed every aspect of their existence. From the food they ate, to the work they did, to the way they raised their children. The political impact of Akhenaten's reforms was perhaps the most dangerous of all, threatening the very foundations of Egyptian power and influence in the ancient world. Egypt's empire had been built on the careful management of relationships. With vassal states and allied kingdoms throughout the Near East, these relationships were maintained through a complex system of diplomacy, trade, and military intervention that required constant attention from the pharaoh and his administrators. But Akhenaten, obsessed with his religious revolution and the construction of his new capital, began to neglect these crucial responsibilities. He seemed to believe that the power of the Aten would protect Egypt from its enemies, and that his religious revolution was more important than the mundane concerns of empire management. This neglect would have catastrophic consequences for Egypt's international position and would contribute to the eventual collapse of his revolutionary experiment. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered at Akhenaten in the late 19th century, revealed the growing crisis in Egypt's foreign relations during Akhenaten's reign. These letters, written in cuneiform script on clay tablets, provide a unique window into the international politics of the ancient world and show how Akhenaten's neglect of foreign affairs was undermining Egypt's position as a great power. Vassal kings from across the Near East wrote desperate letters pleading for military assistance against rebellious subjects or foreign invaders. The king of Jerusalem begged for help against attacking tribes. The ruler of Byblus warned that his city was about to fall to enemies. The governor of Gaza reported that his territory was being overrun by hostile forces. But these pleas for help were largely ignored by Akhenaten, who was too focused on his religious reforms to pay attention to the crumbling of his empire. Allied rulers complained about the lack of Egyptian support and threatened to switch their allegiance to Egypt's enemies. The king of Assyria expressed frustration with the breakdown in diplomatic relations. The ruler of Babylon complained about the disruption of trade relationships. The Hittite king began to expand his influence into territories that had previously been under Egyptian control. Taking advantage of Akhenaten's distraction and neglect, trade partners expressed frustration with the disruption of commercial relationships that had been built up over generations. The flow of goods that had sustained Egyptian prosperity began to slow as trading partners lost confidence in Egypt's stability and reliability. The tribute that had poured into Egypt from vassal states began to dry up as local rulers questioned whether Egypt was still strong enough to enforce its demands. This neglect of foreign policy was not just a matter of poor administration, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how empires work. Akhenaten seemed to believe that Egypt's power was so great and so divinely ordained that it could survive any challenge. He failed to understand that empires require constant maintenance, that relationships with allies and vassals must be carefully cultivated, and that military strength must be demonstrated regularly to deter potential enemies. The internal opposition to Akhenaten's reforms was also growing, though it remained largely hidden due to the pharaoh's absolute power and the severe penalties for dissent. While no one dared to challenge the pharaoh directly, there were increasing signs of resistance throughout Egyptian society. Traditional priests went underground, continuing to worship the old gods in secret. Local officials found ways to circumvent the new religious requirements while appearing to comply with royal decrees. Even within the royal court, there were those who questioned the wisdom of abandoning traditions that had served Egypt well for centuries. The military, in particular, was becoming increasingly restless and demoralized. Egyptian soldiers had been raised on stories of the great pharaohs who had expanded the empire and brought glory to Egypt through conquest. They had been taught to revere the traditional gods who protected Egypt in battle and ensured victory over its enemies. Amun-Ra was particularly important to the military, as he was seen as the god of war and victory. Akhenaten's pacifist approach to foreign policy and his abandonment of the traditional gods struck many soldiers as a betrayal of everything they had been taught to value. The military had always been one of the most conservative institutions in Egyptian society, deeply attached to tradition and suspicious of change. The idea that their traditional gods were false and that their military traditions were meaningless was deeply disturbing to men who had devoted their lives to serving Egypt's military might. The economic elite were also growing concerned about the direction of Akhenaten's reforms and their impact on Egyptian prosperity. The traditional religious system had provided them with opportunities for advancement and profit through service to the temples and participation in religious festivals. The temples had been major employers and economic centers, providing contracts for construction, decoration, and maintenance that had enriched countless craftsmen, merchants, and administrators. The new system centered entirely on the royal family, and the worship of the Aten offered fewer opportunities for personal advancement and seemed to concentrate all power and wealth in the hands of the pharaoh and his immediate circle. The construction of Akhenaten provided some economic opportunities, but these were limited to those who were willing to abandon their traditional homes and move to the new capital. Even the common people, initially perhaps intrigued by the novelty of Akhenaten's reforms, began to grow weary of the constant changes and disruptions. The traditional religious festivals had provided them with entertainment, community bonding, and relief from the hardships of daily life. These festivals had been times of joy and celebration, when the normal social hierarchies were temporarily relaxed and everyone could participate in the worship of the gods. The new religion, with its emphasis on the abstract worship of the Aten and its focus on the royal family, offered little in the way of popular participation or emotional satisfaction. The ceremonies at Akhenaten were formal and distant, lacking the warmth and community spirit of the traditional festivals. The common people felt excluded from the new religious order, which seemed to be designed for the benefit of the royal family rather than the entire population. As Akhenaten's reign progressed, these various sources of opposition began to coalesce into a growing movement of resistance. While no one dared to challenge the pharaoh directly, there were increasing signs that his revolutionary experiment was failing to win the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people. The very foundations of his new order were beginning to crack under the weight of practical problems and popular discontent. The personal life of the royal family also began to show signs of strain during this period, adding to the growing sense that the Aten was not protecting his chosen representatives as promised. Nefertiti, who had been Akhenaten's partner in the religious revolution and one of the most visible symbols of the new order, began to disappear from official records around the 12th year of his reign. Some historians believe she died, possibly from one of the plagues that swept through the ancient world during this period. Others suggest she may have fallen out of favor with her husband, perhaps because she questioned some aspects of his religious reforms, or because she was unable to provide him with a male heir. Still others propose that she may have been exiled from the court, or even murdered by opponents of the new religion. Her disappearance removed one of the most visible and charismatic symbols of the new religion, and may have signaled the beginning of the end for Akhenaten's revolutionary experiment. Nefertiti had been more than just a queen. She had been a religious leader, a political partner, and a symbol of the new order's promise of equality and renewal. Her loss was a devastating blow to the morale of Akhenaten's supporters and a sign to his enemies that the new order was beginning to crumble. The royal couple's 6 daughters, who had been central to the propaganda of the new religion, also began to face difficulties that undermined the claims about the Aten's protective power. Several died young, possibly from plague or other diseases that swept through the new capital. Their deaths were seen by many as signs that the Aten was not protecting the royal family as promised, undermining one of the key claims of the new religion. These deaths were particularly devastating because they contradicted the fundamental promise of the new religion. Akhenaten had claimed that the Aten would protect and bless his faithful followers, and the royal family was supposed to be the ultimate example of this divine protection. When the pharaoh's own children began to die, it raised serious questions about the power and benevolence of the new god. Akhenaten himself began to show signs of increasing isolation and paranoia during the later years of his reign. Cut off from the traditional sources of information and advice that had guided previous pharaohs, surrounded by courtiers who told him only what he wanted to hear, he seems to have lost touch with the reality of Egypt's situation. His artistic representations from this period show him as increasingly gaunt and otherworldly, as if he were withdrawing from the physical world into a realm of pure spiritual contemplation. The pharaoh, who had once been so concerned with realistic artistic representation, now appeared in reliefs and sculptures that emphasized his otherworldly nature. His features became more exaggerated, his body more elongated, his expression more distant and mystical. It was as if he was transforming himself into a purely spiritual being. abandoning the physical world that was proving so resistant to his revolutionary vision. The international situation continued to deteriorate as Egypt's enemies took advantage of Akhenaten's neglect of foreign policy. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's main rival for control of the Near East, began to expand its influence into territories that had previously been under Egyptian control. Local rulers who had been loyal to Egypt for generations began to switch their allegiance to the Hittites or to declare their independence. The carefully constructed network of alliances and dependencies that had sustained Egyptian power for centuries was beginning to unravel. Egypt's reputation as an invincible military power was being damaged by its failure to respond to challenges and protect its allies. The tribute and trade that had sustained Egyptian prosperity were being disrupted by the political instability and military weakness that resulted from Akhenaten's neglect. Within Egypt itself, the signs of crisis were becoming impossible to ignore. The economy was struggling under the weight of the massive resources devoted to building and maintaining Akhenaten. The traditional agricultural and craft production that had sustained Egyptian prosperity was being disrupted by the religious reforms and the relocation of the capital. Trade relationships that had taken generations to build were being damaged by the instability and uncertainty surrounding rule. The military situation was particularly alarming. Egypt's professional army, which had been the foundation of its imperial power, was becoming demoralized and ineffective. The traditional military virtues of courage, loyalty, and devotion to the gods were being undermined by Akhenaten's pacifist philosophy and religious reforms. Recruitment was becoming difficult as young men lost faith in the traditional military career path. Training and equipment were suffering as resources were diverted to religious projects. The administrative system that had governed Egypt for centuries was also beginning to break down. The traditional bureaucracy, with its carefully defined hierarchies and procedures, was being disrupted by Akhenaten's constant innovations and reforms. Experienced administrators were being replaced by religious zealots who lacked the practical skills needed to govern effectively. The legal system, based on centuries of precedent and tradition, was being undermined by the constant changes in religious law and practice. As the 17th year of Akhenaten's reign drew to a close, it was becoming clear that his revolutionary experiment was failing. The new religion had failed to win popular acceptance. The new capital was draining Egypt's resources, and the new political system was proving incapable of governing effectively. The empire was crumbling, the economy was struggling, and the people were growing increasingly restless. And then, suddenly and mysteriously, Akhenaten died. The circumstances of his death remain one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Some historians believe he died of natural causes, possibly from the genetic disorders that seem to have affected his family and may have been responsible for his unusual physical appearance. Others suggest he may have been assassinated by opponents of his reforms, who saw his death as the only way to save Egypt from complete collapse. Still others propose that he may have died in a plague that swept through Akhenaten during the final years of his reign, a plague that may have been seen by his enemies as divine punishment for his abandonment of the traditional gods. The fact that several members of his family also died during this period lends some support to this theory. Whatever the cause of his death, its timing could not have been more critical for Egypt. The kingdom was in crisis, the empire was collapsing, and the people were desperate for a return to stability and tradition. The question was whether revolutionary experiment would survive his death, or whether Egypt would return to the old ways that had sustained it for centuries. The answer came quickly and decisively. Akhenaten was succeeded by a mysterious figure known as Smenkhkare, who may have been his brother, his son, or even Nefertiti in disguise. Smenkkare's reign was brief and chaotic, lasting only a few years before he too died under mysterious circumstances. The throne then passed to a young boy named Tutankhaten, who would later become famous as Tutankhamun. Tutankhaten was probably Akhenaten's son, though the exact nature of their relationship remains unclear due to the deliberate destruction of records from this period. What is clear is that he was very young when he came to the throne, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old. This meant that real power was exercised by his advisors, particularly a military commander named Horemheb and a high official named Ai. These advisors faced an enormous challenge. Egypt was in crisis, its empire was crumbling, its economy was struggling, and its people were demoralized. The revolutionary experiment of Akhenaten had failed, but the damage it had caused was extensive and would take years to repair. The question was whether Egypt could be restored to its former glory or whether the damage was too severe to overcome. The advisors' first priority was to restore stability and legitimacy to the monarchy. This meant abandoning Akhenaten's revolutionary reforms and returning to the traditional religious and political systems that had sustained Egypt for centuries. The worship of the Aton was abandoned. The traditional gods were restored to their temples, and the priesthood was given back its power and wealth. To symbolize this restoration, the young pharaoh's name was changed from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Ammon. This change was more than symbolic. It represented a complete rejection of Akhenaten's religious revolution and a return to the worship of Amun-Ra as the king of the gods. The capital was moved back from Akhenaten to Memphis and Thebes, the traditional centers of Egyptian power. Akhenaten itself was abandoned, its buildings left to crumble in the desert, its art and inscriptions defaced or destroyed. The great experiment in creating a new kind of Egyptian civilization was over, and the old order was being restored with a vengeance. But the restoration was not just about returning to the old ways. It was also about erasing all memory of Akhenaten's reign. The new government embarked on a systematic campaign to remove all traces of the heretic Pharaoh from Egyptian records. His name was chiseled out of inscriptions. His monuments were destroyed or reused for other purposes, and his artistic innovations were abandoned in favor of traditional styles. This campaign of erasure was remarkably thorough and effective. Within a generation, Akhenaten had been virtually forgotten by the Egyptian people. His name disappeared from king lists, his reign was omitted from official histories, and his revolutionary ideas were treated as if they had never existed. The priests and scribes who had lived through his reign were either dead or had been convinced to remain silent about their experiences. The erasure was so complete that when later pharaohs referred to the period of Akhenaten's reign, they called it simply the time of the enemy or the rebellion. they refused even to speak his name, as if doing so might somehow bring back the chaos and instability of his revolutionary experiment. The man who had tried to transform Egyptian civilization had been transformed himself into a non-person, a gap in history that was not supposed to exist. This systematic erasure was motivated by more than just political considerations. The Egyptians believed that memory was essential to existence in the afterlife. To be forgotten was to suffer the second death, a complete annihilation of the soul that was worse than physical death. By erasing Akhenaten's memory, his successors were not just removing him from history, they were condemning him to eternal oblivion. The campaign against Akhenaten's memory was also extended to his family and supporters. Nefertiti's name was removed from monuments, her images were defaced, and her role in the religious revolution was erased from official records. The royal daughters who had died during Akhenaten's reign were forgotten, their tombs left unmarked and their names omitted from royal genealogies. Even Tutankhamun, despite his role in restoring the traditional order, was affected by this campaign of erasure because he was associated with Akhenaten's family. His own reign was downplayed in official records, and his achievements were minimized. When he died young, probably in his late teens, he was buried in a relatively modest tomb that reflected his diminished status in official memory. The military commander Horemheb, who eventually became Pharaoh himself, was particularly zealous. In erasing Akhenaten's legacy, he ordered the destruction of Akhenaten's buildings and the reuse of their stones for his own construction projects. He had Akhenaten's name removed from every monument and inscription he could find. He even went so far as to claim credit for the restoration of traditional religion, presenting himself as the savior who had rescued Egypt from the chaos of the heretic's reign. This campaign of erasure was so successful that for over 3,000 years, Akhenaten remained virtually unknown to the outside world. Ancient Greek and Roman historians, who wrote extensively about Egyptian history, made no mention of him. Medieval Arab scholars, who had access to Egyptian records, found no trace of his reign. Even early modern Egyptologists, who began to decipher hieroglyphic inscriptions in the 19th century, initially found no evidence of his existence. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists began to uncover the remains of Akhenaten and piece together the story of Akhenaten's reign. The discovery of the Amarna letters in the 1880s provided the first concrete evidence of his existence. The excavation of Akhenaten itself revealed the scope and ambition of his revolutionary experiment, and the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 provided crucial clues about the family relationships and political dynamics of the Amarna period. As more evidence emerged, scholars began to realize the full significance of what Akhenaten had attempted. Here was a pharaoh who had tried to revolutionize one of the world's oldest and most conservative civilizations. He had introduced monotheism, 1,500 years before it became widespread in the Mediterranean world. He had created a new form of art that broke with millennia of tradition. He had attempted to concentrate all religious and political power in the person of the pharaoh. The rediscovery of Akhenaten raised profound questions about the nature of religious and political revolution in the ancient world. How had one man been able to transform Egyptian civilization so completely, even if only temporarily? What had motivated him to abandon traditions that had sustained Egypt for centuries? Why had his experiment failed so completely that it was erased from memory? Today, Akhenaten is recognized as one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of the ancient world. His religious revolution, though ultimately unsuccessful, represents one of the earliest attempts to establish monotheism as a state religion. His artistic innovations, though short-lived, produced some of the most beautiful and naturalistic art in Egyptian history. His political experiment, though it ended in failure, demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of revolutionary change in the ancient world. The pharaoh who tried to delete himself from history has instead become one of the most studied and debated rulers of ancient Egypt. His story serves as a reminder that even the most powerful individuals cannot completely control how they are remembered, and that the truth has a way of emerging even from the deepest shadows of the past. As we drift toward sleep tonight, we can ponder the strange irony of Akhenaten's legacy. The pharaoh who sought to create a new world ended up being erased from the old one. The man who proclaimed himself the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine became a forgotten footnote in history. The revolutionary who tried to transform Egyptian civilization for all time was himself transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging tradition too radically and too quickly. But perhaps there is another lesson in Akhenaten's story, one that speaks to the enduring power of human creativity and the persistent desire for change and renewal. Even in failure, his experiment demonstrated that no system, no matter how ancient or entrenched, is immune to challenge and transformation. Even in erasure, his memory survived to inspire and instruct future generations. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this great continuum of human experience, this endless story of struggle and achievement, of revolution and restoration, of memory and forgetting, that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization and forward into the unknowable future. The story of Akhenaten's erasure from history is not just about one pharaoh's failed revolution, but about the fundamental tension between innovation and tradition that has shaped human civilization throughout history. In the comfortable darkness of our modern world, it's easy to forget how radical and dangerous Akhenaten's ideas would have seemed to his contemporaries. He was not just changing religious practices, he was challenging the very foundations of reality as the ancient Egyptians understood it. To truly appreciate the magnitude of what Akhenaten attempted, we need to understand the world he was trying to transform. Ancient Egypt was not just a kingdom, but a cosmic order, a carefully balanced system that connected the human world to the divine realm through an intricate web of rituals, traditions, and beliefs. Every aspect of Egyptian life, from the flooding of the Nile to the movement of the stars, was understood to be governed by divine forces that required constant attention and propitiation. The pharaoh was the keystone of this system, the divine king who maintained Mat, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. But he was not alone in this responsibility. The priests served as his partners in maintaining the divine order, performing the daily rituals that kept the gods satisfied and the cosmos in balance. The nobles and officials carried out the administrative tasks that kept the kingdom functioning. The common people provided the labor and tribute that sustained the entire system. This was a world where change was not just unwelcome but dangerous, where innovation could upset the delicate balance that kept the universe functioning properly. The Egyptians had developed their religious and political systems over thousands of years of trial and error, and they believed that any deviation from these proven methods could bring disaster upon the kingdom. The gods were jealous and demanding, quick to punish any slight or neglect, and the consequences of their anger could be catastrophic. Into this conservative tradition-bound world came Akhenaten with his revolutionary vision of a single god, a simplified religion, and a transformed society. From the perspective of his contemporaries, he was not a reformer, but a destroyer, not a visionary, but a madman who was willing to risk the very survival of Egyptian civilization for the sake of his personal beliefs. The daily life in Akhenaten during the height of Akhenaten's reign provides a fascinating glimpse into what this revolutionary society actually looked like in practice. The city was designed to be a utopia, a perfect society where the divine and human worlds could meet in harmony. But the reality was more complex and problematic than the idealistic vision that had inspired its creation. The royal family lived in a series of palaces that were marvels of ancient architecture and engineering. These buildings were designed to capture and channel the light of the Aten, with open courtyards and large windows that allowed the sun's rays to flood every room. The walls were decorated with scenes of natural beauty and family life that celebrated the Aten's creation and the royal family's devotion to their god. The Great Palace was the center of political and religious life in the city. A vast complex of throne rooms, reception halls, and private apartments where Akhenaten held court and conducted the business of governing Egypt. The palace was designed to impress visitors with the power and glory of the new religion, its walls covered with gold leaf and precious stones that reflected the light of the Aten in dazzling displays of divine radiance. But the palace was also a place of increasing isolation and paranoia as Akhenaten's reign progressed. Cut off from the traditional sources of information and advice that had guided previous pharaohs, surrounded by courtiers who were afraid to contradict him, Akhenaten gradually lost touch with the reality of Egypt's situation. The palace became an echo chamber where the pharaoh's revolutionary ideas were constantly reinforced and validated, while dissenting voices were silenced or excluded. The nobles and officials who had followed Akhenaten to his new capital found themselves in a strange and uncertain world where the old rules no longer applied. Many of them had abandoned comfortable positions and established careers to join the pharaoh's revolutionary experiment, and they were now dependent on his favor for their survival and prosperity. This created a culture of sycophancy and fear where honest criticism was dangerous and flattery was rewarded. The tombs that these nobles built for themselves at Akhenaten reveal both their devotion to the new religion and their anxiety about their place in the new order. Unlike traditional Egyptian tombs, which focused on the deceased's journey to the afterlife and their relationship with the traditional gods, the Amarna tombs were filled with scenes of the royal family worshipping the Aten and the tomb owners' service to the pharaoh. These tombs were propaganda pieces designed to demonstrate the nobles' loyalty to Akhenaten and their acceptance of his religious revolution. But they also reveal a deep uncertainty about what would happen to them after death, in a world where the traditional gods had been declared false and the traditional afterlife beliefs had been abandoned. The nobles were gambling their eternal souls on Akhenaten's vision, and the stakes could not have been higher. The common people of Akhenaten lived in a city that was unlike anything that had existed before in Egypt. The traditional Egyptian city had grown organically over centuries, with different neighborhoods developing their own character and identity. But Akhenaten was planned from the beginning as a unified whole, designed according to Akhenaten's vision of how a perfect society should be organized. The residential areas were laid out in a grid pattern that reflected the hierarchical nature of Egyptian society. The most important officials lived in large houses near the royal palaces, while lesser officials and craftsmen lived in smaller houses further from the center of power. The common workers lived in the most modest accommodations on the outskirts of the city. But even these were better than the typical housing available to ordinary Egyptians. In other cities, the city was supplied with water through an ingenious system of wells and channels that brought fresh water from the Nile to every neighborhood. Gardens and parks provided relief from the harsh desert climate, while markets and workshops ensured that the inhabitants had access to all the necessities of life. In many ways, Akhenaten was a more pleasant and livable city than the traditional Egyptian capitals. But the social and psychological atmosphere of the city was tense and uncertain. The inhabitants were cut off from their traditional communities and support networks, dependent on the pharaoh's favor for their survival and prosperity. The traditional festivals and celebrations that had provided structure and meaning to Egyptian life had been replaced by new ceremonies that many people found alien and unsatisfying. The religious life of the city was centered entirely on the worship of the Aten and the glorification of the royal family. The great temple was the focal point of this worship, a vast complex of open courtyards and altars where the pharaoh and his family performed daily rituals in honor of their god. These ceremonies were public spectacles designed to demonstrate the power and glory of the new religion, but they lacked the intimate, community-based character of traditional Egyptian religious practices. The common people were expected to participate in these ceremonies as spectators rather than active participants. They could watch the royal family worship the Aten, but they could not approach the god directly or perform their own rituals. This created a sense of distance and alienation that was very different from the traditional Egyptian religious experience, where ordinary people could visit local temples, make offerings to their favorite gods, and participate in community festivals. The artistic and cultural life of Akhenaten was revolutionary in its naturalism and emotional content, but it was also limited in its scope and appeal. The new art style was beautiful and innovative, but it was also highly specialized and difficult for ordinary craftsmen to master. The traditional artistic conventions that had been developed over centuries were abandoned overnight, leaving many artists struggling to adapt to the new requirements. The literature and poetry of the Amarna period reflected the religious themes of the new order, with hymns and prayers dedicated to the Aten replacing the traditional religious texts. The most famous of these is the Great Hymn to the Aten, which is attributed to Akhenaten himself, and which expresses his vision of the Aten as the sole creator and sustainer of all life. This hymn is a masterpiece of ancient literature, filled with beautiful imagery and profound theological insights. It presents the Aten as a universal god who cares for all creation, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest insect. It celebrates the beauty and diversity of the natural world as evidence of the Aten's creative power. It expresses a vision of divine love and care that was unprecedented in ancient religious literature. But the hymn also reveals the limitations of Akhenaten's religious vision. While it celebrates the Aten's universal love, it also insists that this love can only be accessed through the pharaoh and his family. While it praises the beauty of creation, it also declares that all other gods are false and their worship is meaningless. The hymn is both inclusive and exclusive, universal and particular, reflecting the contradictions that lay at the heart of Akhenaten's revolutionary experiment. The international consequences of Akhenaten's reign extended far beyond Egypt's borders, and had lasting effects on the balance of power in the ancient Near East. Egypt had been the dominant power in the region for centuries, its military might and diplomatic skill maintaining a complex network of alliances and dependencies that stretched from Nubia in the south to Anatolia in the north. This system had been built up over generations of careful diplomacy and occasional military intervention. Egyptian pharaohs had learned to balance the competing interests of their various allies and vassals, using a combination of rewards and punishments to maintain their loyalty. They had developed sophisticated intelligence networks that kept them informed of political developments throughout the region. They had created trade relationships that benefited all parties while ensuring Egypt's continued prosperity. But Akhenaten's neglect of foreign policy disrupted all of these carefully constructed relationships. His failure to respond to requests for military assistance undermined Egypt's reputation as a reliable ally. His neglect of diplomatic correspondence damaged relationships that had taken generations to build. His focus on domestic religious reform left Egypt's enemies free to expand their influence and challenge Egyptian hegemony. The Hittite Empire was the primary beneficiary of Egypt's weakness during this period. The Hittites had been Egypt's main rival for control of the Near East for over a century, and they were quick to take advantage of Akhenaten's distraction. Hittite armies moved into territories that had previously been under Egyptian control, while Hittite diplomats worked to turn Egypt's allies against their former protector. The kingdom of Mitanni, which had been Egypt's most important ally in the region, found itself caught between the expanding Hittite Empire and an Egypt that seemed unwilling or unable to provide effective support. Mitanni's rulers sent desperate letters to Akhenaten pleading for military assistance, but their pleas were largely ignored. Eventually, Mitanni was conquered by the Hittites, eliminating one of Egypt's most important strategic partners. The city-states of Syria and Palestine, which had been under Egyptian protection for generations, began to question whether Egypt was still strong enough to defend them. Local rulers who had been loyal to Egypt for decades began to consider switching their allegiance to the Hittites or declaring their independence. Some cities that had been peaceful for generations erupted in rebellion as local populations lost confidence in Egyptian protection. The economic consequences of these political changes were severe and long-lasting. The tribute that had flowed into Egypt from its vassals and allies began to dry up as these relationships deteriorated. The trade routes that had brought exotic goods and raw materials to Egypt were disrupted by political instability and military conflict. The gold mines of Nubia, which had been one of Egypt's most important sources of wealth, became more difficult to defend and exploit. The military situation was particularly alarming for Egypt's long-term security. The Egyptian army, which had been the foundation of the kingdom's power for centuries, was becoming demoralized and ineffective under Akhenaten's pacifist leadership. The traditional military virtues of courage, discipline, and devotion to the gods were being undermined by the pharaoh's religious reforms and his apparent lack of interest in military affairs. Recruitment became increasingly difficult as young men lost faith in the military career path that had traditionally offered opportunities for advancement and glory. The professional officer corps, which had been the backbone of Egyptian military power, began to question their loyalty to a pharaoh who seemed to have abandoned the martial traditions that had made Egypt great. Training and equipment suffered as resources were diverted to religious projects and the construction of Akhenaten. The weapons and armor that had given Egyptian soldiers their edge in battle became outdated as Egypt's enemies adopted new technologies and tactics. The fortifications that protected Egypt's borders were neglected as attention focused on building temples and palaces in the new capital. The intelligence networks that had kept Egypt informed of threats and opportunities throughout the region began to break down as diplomatic relationships deteriorated. Egyptian spies and informants found themselves cut off from their sources of information, while enemy agents found it easier to operate in a kingdom that was distracted by internal religious conflicts. The restoration period that followed Akhenaten's death was one of the most remarkable recoveries in ancient history, demonstrating both the resilience of Egyptian civilization and the fundamental conservatism of its people. The advisors who governed Egypt during Tutankhamun's minority faced an enormous challenge in rebuilding a kingdom that had been severely damaged by 17 years of revolutionary experimentation. Their first priority was to restore the religious and cultural foundations of Egyptian civilization. The temples that had been closed during Akhenaten's reign were reopened and restored to their former glory. The priests who had been displaced were recalled to their positions and given back their traditional privileges and responsibilities. The festivals and ceremonies that had been banned were revived with even greater enthusiasm than before. This religious restoration was not just about returning to the old ways. It was also about healing the psychological and spiritual wounds that Akhenaten's revolution had inflicted on the Egyptian people. The sudden abandonment of the traditional gods had left many people feeling lost and disconnected from their cultural roots. The restoration of traditional worship provided them with a sense of continuity and stability that had been missing during the Amarna period. The economic recovery was equally impressive and demonstrated the fundamental strength of Egyptian civilization. The wealth that had been concentrated in Akhenaten was redistributed throughout the kingdom, reviving local economies that had been neglected during Akhenaten's reign. The trade relationships that had been damaged by political instability were gradually rebuilt through patient diplomacy and economic incentives. The agricultural system that was the foundation of Egyptian prosperity was restored to full productivity through careful attention to irrigation and flood control. The craft industries that had been disrupted by the move to Akhenaten were revived and expanded to meet the demand for goods needed to restore the temples and palaces. The mining operations that had been neglected were reopened and modernized to increase their productivity. The military recovery was perhaps the most crucial aspect of the restoration, as Egypt needed to rebuild its reputation as a formidable military power if it was to regain its position in the international arena. The demoralized and weakened army that Akhenaten had left behind was gradually rebuilt through improved training, better equipment, and renewed emphasis on traditional military values. New recruitment campaigns attracted young men who were eager to serve in a military that had regained its sense of purpose and pride. The officer corps was purged of those who had been too closely associated with Akhenaten's pacifist policies, and replaced with commanders who understood the importance of military strength in maintaining Egypt's security and prosperity. The fortifications that protected Egypt's borders were rebuilt and modernized to meet the challenges posed by new military technologies and tactics. The intelligence networks that had been neglected during Akhenaten's reign were re-established and expanded to provide better information about threats and opportunities throughout the region. The diplomatic recovery was equally important and required careful negotiation with allies and enemies who had lost confidence in Egypt's reliability and strength. The new government had to convince former allies that Egypt was once again a trustworthy partner while deterring enemies who had taken advantage of Egypt's weakness during the Amarna period. This diplomatic offensive was remarkably successful, demonstrating the enduring appeal of Egyptian civilization and the respect that Egypt still commanded throughout the ancient world. Former allies were gradually won back through a combination of military demonstrations, economic incentives, and patient diplomacy. New alliances were formed with kingdoms that had previously been neutral or hostile. The process of erasing Akhenaten's memory from Egyptian records was not just an act of political revenge, but a carefully calculated strategy to restore confidence in the monarchy and the traditional religious system by removing all traces of the heretic Pharaoh from official records. The new government was able to present the restoration as a return to the natural order rather than a reaction to a failed experiment. This campaign of erasure was remarkably thorough and systematic, involving not just the destruction of monuments and inscriptions, but also the rewriting of official histories and the suppression of oral traditions. Scribes were ordered to remove Akhenaten's name from all documents and to omit his reign from chronological records. Artists were commissioned to create new works that celebrated the traditional gods and ignored the artistic innovations of the Amarna period. The success of this campaign can be measured by the fact that Akhenaten remained virtually unknown to the outside world for over 3,000 years. Even the ancient Greeks and Romans, who were fascinated by Egyptian history and culture, found no mention of him in the records they were able to access. It was only through the patient work of modern archaeologists that his story was finally recovered and his place in history restored. The rediscovery of Akhenaten in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of archaeology. The first clues came from the Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence that was discovered by local villagers in the ruins of Akhenaten in the 1880s. These tablets, written in cuneiform script, provided the first concrete evidence that a pharaoh named Akhenaten had once ruled Egypt. The excavation of Akhenaten itself, which began in the early 20th century, revealed the scope and ambition of Akhenaten's revolutionary experiment. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of palaces, temples, and residential areas that demonstrated the pharaoh's attempt to create a completely new kind of Egyptian city. They found artistic masterpieces that showed the innovative naturalism of the Amarna style. They discovered inscriptions that revealed the religious and political ideas that had motivated the revolution. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 provided crucial additional evidence about the Amarna period and its aftermath. The treasures found in the tomb demonstrated the wealth and artistic sophistication of the period, while the mummy of the young pharaoh provided physical evidence of his relationship to Akhenaten's family. The tomb also contained objects that showed the transition from the Amarna period back to traditional Egyptian religion and culture. As more evidence emerged, scholars began to appreciate the full significance of what Akhenaten had attempted and achieved. Here was a pharaoh who had introduced monotheism to the ancient world 1,500 years before it became widespread. In the Mediterranean region, he had created a new form of art that broke with millennia of tradition and influenced artistic development for generations. He had attempted to concentrate all religious and political power in the person of the pharaoh, anticipating political developments that would not become common until much later in history. The modern assessment of Akhenaten's legacy is complex and controversial, reflecting the difficulty of evaluating a figure who was both a visionary and a failure, a revolutionary and a destroyer. Some scholars see him as a religious genius who was ahead of his time, a monotheistic pioneer who anticipated the great religious developments of later centuries. Others view him as a dangerous fanatic whose obsession with his own ideas nearly destroyed one of the world's greatest civilizations. Some historians emphasize his artistic and cultural achievements, pointing to the naturalistic art and literature of the Amarna period as evidence of his creative genius. Others focus on his political and military failures, arguing that his neglect of practical governance undermined Egypt's security and prosperity. Some see him as a champion of religious freedom who challenged the corrupt power of the priesthood. Others view him as an authoritarian dictator who imposed his personal beliefs on an unwilling population. The truth, as is often the case with complex historical figures, probably lies somewhere between these extreme positions. Akhenaten was neither a pure genius nor a complete failure, neither a saint nor a monster, but a human being whose extraordinary vision was matched by equally extraordinary limitations. His story reminds us that even the most powerful individuals are products of their time and circumstances, shaped by forces beyond their control and limited by their own human frailties. The pharaoh who tried to delete himself from history has instead become one of the most studied and debated figures of the ancient world. His revolutionary experiment, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of radical change in human societies. His artistic innovations, though short-lived in their original form, influenced the development of art and culture for generations. His religious ideas, though rejected by his contemporaries, anticipated developments that would transform the ancient world. Perhaps most importantly, Akhenaten's story serves as a reminder that history is not just about the winners, but also about those who dared to dream of something different, even if their dreams ultimately failed to become reality. In our own age of rapid change and social transformation, his example reminds us that the desire for renewal and reform is as old as civilization itself, and that the tension between tradition and innovation is one of the fundamental forces that drives human progress. As the gentle flames of our imaginary fire begin to fade and the shadows of sleep gather around us, we can reflect on the strange irony of Akhenaten's fate. The pharaoh who sought to create a new world ended up being erased from the old one. The man who proclaimed himself the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine became a forgotten footnote in history. The revolutionary who tried to transform Egyptian civilization for all time was himself transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging tradition too radically and too quickly. But perhaps there is another lesson in Akhenaten's story, one that speaks to the enduring power of human creativity and the persistent desire for change and renewal. Even in failure, his experiment demonstrated that no system, no matter how ancient or entrenched, is immune to challenge and transformation, even in erasure. His memory survived to inspire and instruct future generations about the possibilities and perils of revolutionary change. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you are part of this great continuum of human experience, this endless story of struggle and achievement, of revolution and restoration, of memory and forgetting that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization, and forward into the unknowable future. In your dreams, you might find yourself walking through the ruins of Akhenaten, feeling the desert wind that once carried the prayers of the heretic Pharaoh, and understanding something of the eternal human desire to create something new and lasting in this ancient and ever-changing world. The legacy of Akhenaten extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Egypt, and continues to influence our understanding of religion, politics, and human nature in the modern world. His story has been retold countless times in novels, films, and academic studies, each generation finding new meaning and relevance in his revolutionary experiment. Some see him as a precursor to modern religious reformers, others as an early example of totalitarian dictatorship, and still others as a tragic figure whose noble vision was destroyed by the limitations of his time and circumstances. The parallels between Akhenaten's religious revolution and later monotheistic movements have been noted by scholars for over a century. The similarities between his great hymn to the Aten and certain biblical psalms have led some to suggest that his ideas may have influenced the development of Hebrew monotheism. The emphasis on divine love and universal care in Atenism has been compared to the teachings of later religious reformers who sought to simplify and purify their faith traditions. But these comparisons also highlight the unique aspects of Akhenaten's experiment that set it apart from later religious developments. Unlike most religious reformers, who worked within existing traditions to gradually change beliefs and practices, Akhenaten attempted to completely replace the religious system of his time with something entirely new. Unlike most monotheistic movements, which emerged from popular religious experiences and gradually gained institutional support, Atenism was imposed from above by royal decree and never gained widespread popular acceptance. The political aspects of Akhenaten's revolution have also attracted considerable attention from modern scholars and political theorists. His attempt to concentrate all religious and political authority in the person of the pharaoh has been seen as an early example of totalitarian government, anticipating the dictatorships of the 20th century. His use of art and propaganda to promote his political agenda has been compared to the techniques used by modern authoritarian regimes to control public opinion and suppress dissent. But these comparisons, while illuminating, can also be misleading if they ignore the specific historical context in which Akhenaten operated. The ancient world was very different from the modern world, with different concepts of individual rights, religious freedom, and political legitimacy. What seems like tyranny to modern observers may have been seen as necessary reform by Akhenaten and his supporters, who believed they were saving Egypt from corruption and stagnation. The artistic legacy of the Amarna period has had a profound and lasting impact on our understanding of ancient Egyptian culture and on the development of art history as a discipline. The naturalistic style that emerged during Akhenaten's reign challenged long-held assumptions about the rigid conservatism of Egyptian art and demonstrated that even the most traditional cultures are capable of dramatic innovation and change. The discovery of masterpieces like the bust of Nefertiti and the intimate family scenes from Amarna tombs revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egyptian artistic capabilities and aesthetic sensibilities. These works showed that Egyptian artists were capable of the same naturalism and emotional expression that we associate with the greatest art of other ancient civilizations, but that they had been constrained by religious and political conventions that limited their creative freedom. The influence of Amarna art can be seen in the work of modern artists who have been inspired by its combination of naturalism and its emotional intensity, and its innovative approach to depicting the human form. The elongated figures and expressive faces that characterize the Amarna style have been echoed in the work of artists from the early 20th century to the present day. The archaeological legacy of Akhenaten has also been enormously important for our understanding of ancient urban planning and architecture. The city represents one of the few examples of a completely planned ancient city, designed from the beginning, according to a unified vision rather than growing organically over time. The excavation of the site has provided invaluable information about how ancient cities were constructed, how they functioned, and how they reflected the social and political values of their inhabitants. The preservation of Akhenaten has been challenging due to its location in the desert and the fragility of its mud brick construction. Many of the buildings have been damaged by wind erosion, flash floods, and human activity over the centuries, but ongoing archaeological work continues to reveal new information about the city and its inhabitants, adding to our understanding of this unique experiment in ancient urban planning. The study of Akhenaten and the Amarna period has also contributed to our understanding of ancient Egyptian society and culture more generally. The detailed records from this period, including the Amarna letters and the inscriptions from tombs and temples, provide a unique window into the daily life, political relationships, and religious beliefs of ancient Egyptians. These sources have helped scholars to understand how Egyptian society functioned, how it changed over time, and how it compared to other ancient civilizations. The international correspondence from the Amarna period has been particularly valuable for understanding the diplomatic and political relationships of the ancient Near East. These letters reveal the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and dependencies that connected the great powers of the ancient world. They show how diplomacy was conducted, how conflicts were resolved, and how trade and cultural exchange were managed across vast distances. The medical and scientific aspects of Akhenaten's story have also attracted considerable attention from modern researchers. The unusual physical characteristics depicted in the art have led to extensive speculation about possible genetic disorders that may have affected the royal family. Some scholars have suggested that Akhenaten may have suffered from Marfan syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, or other genetic conditions that could explain his distinctive appearance. These medical theories remain controversial and speculative, as the evidence is limited, and the artistic conventions of the Amarna period make it difficult to distinguish between realistic depiction and stylistic exaggeration. But the investigation of these possibilities has contributed to our understanding of ancient Egyptian medicine and has demonstrated the value of interdisciplinary approaches to historical research. The environmental and climatic context of Akhenaten's reign has also been the subject of recent research, as scholars have sought to understand how natural factors may have influenced the political and social developments of the period. Some studies have suggested that climate change and environmental degradation may have contributed to the instability and conflict that characterized the late 18th dynasty. Evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and other paleoclimatic sources suggests that the 14th century BCE was a period of significant climate change in the eastern Mediterranean region. Droughts, floods, and other environmental disasters may have disrupted agricultural production, weakened political institutions, and contributed to the social unrest that marked the end of the Bronze Age. These environmental factors may help to explain why Akhenaten's revolution occurred when it did, and why it ultimately failed. A period of environmental stress and uncertainty may have created conditions that were favorable to radical political and religious change, but the same conditions may have made it difficult to sustain such changes over the long term. The psychological and sociological aspects of Akhenaten's story have also been explored by modern scholars who are interested in understanding the dynamics of religious and political revolution. The rapid transformation of Egyptian society during his reign provides a case study in how radical change can be imposed from above, and how societies respond to such dramatic disruptions of traditional patterns. The resistance to Akhenaten's reforms, both open and hidden, illustrates the power of traditional beliefs and practices to survive even the most determined attempts at suppression. The eventual restoration of the old order demonstrates the difficulty of permanently changing deeply rooted cultural patterns, even when such change is backed by absolute political power. The role of individual personality and psychology in historical change is also highlighted by Akhenaten's story. His unusual character, his visionary temperament, and his apparent inability to compromise or adapt his ideas to practical realities all played crucial roles in both the initial success and ultimate failure of his revolution. His story reminds us that history is shaped not just by impersonal forces, but also by the unique characteristics of individual human beings. As we consider Akhenaten's place in the broader sweep of human history, we can see him as both a unique individual and a representative of universal human tendencies. His desire to reform and renew his society, his belief in the possibility of creating a better world, and his willingness to challenge established authority are characteristics that we can recognize in reformers and revolutionaries throughout history at the same time. His limitations, his failures, and his ultimate defeat remind us of the constraints that shape all human endeavors. Even the most powerful individuals are limited by the circumstances of their time, the resistance of established interests, and their own human frailties. The gap between vision and reality, between intention and achievement, is a constant theme in human history, and Akhenaten's story illustrates this gap with particular clarity. The enduring fascination with Akhenaten's story reflects our own ongoing struggles with questions of tradition and innovation, authority and freedom, individual vision and collective wisdom in our own age of rapid change and social transformation. His example reminds us that the desire for renewal and reform is as old as civilization itself, and that the tension between old and new is one of the fundamental forces that drives human progress. His story also reminds us of the importance of memory and the power of forgetting in shaping human consciousness. The systematic erasure of Akhenaten from Egyptian records was not just an act of political revenge, but an attempt to control the narrative of history and to determine what future generations would remember about the past. The eventual rediscovery of his story demonstrates that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression, but it also shows how much of the past may be lost forever when memory is deliberately destroyed.